Dr. Marchangizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about a failure of mine, I think, over the years now, in retrospect, after sort of this mass COVID event has occurred, and it's that I think many of us have many of the same thought processes, which is why I think it's worth doing, don't necessarily stand up and fight all of the kinds of crazy virtue signal positions that occur in society. I often keep my mouth shut. I would just talk about science for up until March of 2020. Other than free expression related things, I never bothered to get into these things. There's typical left-right stuff. I never really wanted to get involved in left-right, kind of this standard bomb throwing from one side to the other. And COVID, I felt, was qualitatively different. And the main qualitative difference wasn't necessarily the level of crazy. It was the speed of the crazy. And so I said, I can't just sit still and do this. But let me walk through a few of the kinds of arguments that I think were implicitly inside me for why I didn't want to get into all of the kinds of stuff that would pop up and I thought were potentially crazy. And let me just mention them, and I'll see if I can give counter arguments to them in light of sort of realizing the kinds of disasters, more feeling it in our bones, because it's happened and we've experienced it rather than just being in books. What the counter arguments are to these intuitions or feelings that I had that kept me quiet and potentially keeps you and many others quiet. And the first was, it's not my shtick to talk about those other things, right? I've got my own shtick. My shtick as a scientist, I'm a particular kind of scientist, good at theories, grand unifying kinds of theories, more of a philosopher scientist of sorts. And talking about free expression sort of fit in that, but I didn't want to be getting into every sort of debate about, whatever the debate is of the moment, and a lot of these crazy things that sweep through. Global warming, I may have talked about climate change here and there, but I didn't really want to get into that either and become a figure associated with this or that kinds of causes. I wanted to be really associated with the deep kinds of things that I was focused on in life. And so that was one argument. Now the counter argument is, the main argument that's really going to run through all of these is that all that it takes for crazy ideas to begin to spread is that folks initially, at the beginning, keep their mouths shut. As it starts, even if you watch, just a few people aren't responding to what is clearly crazy. They're just saying, they're just keeping their heads down. Forget about them actively, being part of it. Just enough to watch that others are keeping their heads down for you to say, okay, I'm going to keep my head down. And that just encourages, it's a positive feedback loop that leads more and more people to keeping their heads down. And then you can have just 5% of the population that are excited and enthusiastic and sort of cult members on whatever this crazy idea is enough to create a wave that goes through, and the majority, could well be a majority, just keep their mouths shut and they do nothing. And that process happens very early because we all have a propensity to keep our mouths shut because we see others keeping their mouths shut, and we want to avoid getting into that for all the reasons that I'm going to describe. So the first reason is it's not my shtick. Everybody's got their shtick. Hey, my shtick is talking about sports. I don't want to talk about that. My shtick is cars, whatever it might be that you talk about, or relationship, advice. My shtick in life is just to not get into these arguments. I'm not online. Whatever it is, they keep their mouths shut. They don't want to talk about these sorts of things. We all have our shtick. And I think that's potentially a dangerous thing because that leaves us open for these waves of irrationality and the formations of these things. I think we all have to immediately just say, no, that's dumb. That's dumb. That's just ridiculous. You don't have to get into it. I was going to mention next. The second reason is that it's often embarrassing to have to say the obvious. Many of these virtue positions, they're inherently crazy positions. If they weren't somewhat crazy, somewhat weird, sometimes even self-contradictory, obviously unfair, obviously something, if they weren't loopy, they wouldn't work as virtue positions, because otherwise people outside of that community would be happy to hold them, right? So they are always somewhat crazy, and I want to focus on ideas that are kind of interesting and non-trivial. I'm not interested in publishing papers or writing books about obvious stuff, right? So why should I? It's sort of embarrassing. It's like, no, it's totally unfair if you do that. Obviously unfair, and everybody can see that it's unfair. It's written on its sleeve that it's unfair for trans women to compete with, biological women in sports, for example, right? So I don't want to get deep in these debates. It's sort of embarrassing to do that. So that's another kind of reason. I want to focus my energies on stuff that's non-trivial. Like, oh, look at that. Mark's saying something I wouldn't have expected. It's the opposite of what I would have expected. That's kind of cool stuff. So I'm kind of bored to have to say sort of obvious stuff, but we have to. We all have to just say it. someone says this, it's like, no, I don't, that's just dumb. All right, well, the third reason is that if it's crazy, and I've mentioned this before, it's crazy, why should I be arguing against crazy? And I think you don't have to actually argue against the crazy. You don't have to waste your time arguing. Just confidently signal that you're not part of the club and tell it, look, I think that stuff is stupid. You don't have to necessarily, it's just obviously unfair and it's stupid. And you don't have to engage them because there's really nothing to engage. Of course, they've created a narrative where they've created all of these justifications post hoc, as we've talked about before. But I think you're wasting your time genuinely in life if you're just engaging in every single one, in all of the detailed arguments. It's not really about that. It's really, these things are due to the formation of these groups, which then post hoc evolve justifications for them and these narratives. And I think the best pushback is to confidently state that you're not in that club and that you think it's wrong or irrational or both. Another kind of thing that always occurred to me, I'm getting bitten by mosquitoes out here. Another important thing is just, can I even say it? So for example, there's a lot of things that have been coming up more recently is, can I even say it at all? Like, I may be able to say it once on Twitter, but then I'm banned from Twitter, right? So it's just more of a practicality. Can I even, is it even worthwhile to try to say it if I'm immediately censored for doing so? So it's just, what's the hope? Well, I think there's ways around that. If we're clever, you can come up with ways of signaling it, saying it in such a way that no one really, the censors at Twitter don't know that you're saying this. You can use, abstruse language. You can say it with just pronouns in such a way that it's clear what you're referring to, but there's lots of ways of doing that kind of thing. So I think there's ways to get beyond that. Now, the fifth and potentially the most important that is related to censorship, but it's sort of not the practicality of can I actually do it. It's just like, if I do this, the communities that I'm in and that I'm around potentially will cancel me. It's not just about, it's about losing my voice, but not the practicality, but just the overall consequences to one's life, right? You'll be canceled, you could be suspended, you could be vilified, you could be, every time one of these things happens, those in the out group, whatever we're talking about, immediately become unclean, evil people, right? They become racist, witches, homophobes, the equivalent of these witch-like things in modern day society. Do you really want to get yourself in a position where you're having to become that, You're a denier, whatever. These things come up in every single community, righteous community. Those who push back against them are deniers. And of course, there's a sense in which by the time that's already the case, it's almost too late, right? It is almost too late by then, because the community has already formed, has already created this evolution of these notions of the outgroups and that they're unclean and evil and disgusting and so forth, and worthy of prejudice. But nevertheless, I think in terms of trying to teach principles that we all should have, the bones of free expression, bones of civil liberties, bones of bodily autonomy, and bones of saying that it's stupid the first time you hear it, right? We all have to be able to say, as soon as you hear it, don't duck down. As soon as you duck down, 100 people behind you are going to duck down, and they're going to lead to another 100 for each of them, and it spreads. The ducking down is itself a vicious a contagion that has to be stopped. And the way that we can stop that is to breed in all of us an immediate reaction to say, no, I think that's dumb, that's ridiculous, and you need to say that right from the start. And if you didn't get it from the start, say it later. We all have to have the confidence to say it later, to not let these kinds of toxic forces, and they're going to be sometimes on the left, they're sometimes going to be on the right, sometimes they're going to be just a completely different thing, like medical authoritarianism, which ain't left or right, as we've talked about. And so you just have to have the confidence to say it right from the start. And this goes against, again, this is kind of COVID made me different in this way, in my appreciation for the danger of these collective hysterias. It is not nothing. I'm not doing nothing by merely saying nothing. I'm contributing by keeping my head down. All those years about bunches of other issues, I was complicit, along with hundreds of millions of others, in keeping my head down as those things spread through like wildfire and made things worse and created new kinds of targets and new kinds of outgroups and new kinds of prejudice. And generally, these things typically both wreck society and create further division. And that was your science moment. If you're interested in these kinds of psychosocietal dynamics, take a look at our free Expression Research Institute, freex.group, where we study these sorts of things from a rigorous 21st century perspective. And take a look at Dr. Tim Barber and my new book, Expressly Human. Get it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so forth. And that was your science moment.